How can languages be real if our eyes aren't real? Good question. In some of my videos, I've talked about how we don't really know what a language is, and people have asked me, like, what do you mean by that? Well, in this video, I'm going to take a bit of a break from my Japanese content and kind of answer this question. The fact of the matter is there's a bit of a secret hidden thing among linguistics that we use terms like the Japanese language or the English language, and we use things like, the Osaka dialect, etc. But we don't actually have a working definition of these terms that applies to all situations. There is no objective reality from an academic perspective over the difference between these two. Indeed, in my field, sociolinguistics, I would even argue that there is no objective reality to anything in language. Like, grammars, for instance, aren't real. They're just sort of subconscious agreements. And when we stop agreeing, well, then we get dialects or we get subcultures. And eventually, if enough people don't agree with the older group, then we get new rules that are put into stone. Like a while back, there was a guy in Britain who posted a book saying that this sentence was wrong. And to me, it's not. Apparently, the problem is that warned is a transitive verb in English, so you have to have a direct object. You have to warn somebody. You can't just say warned. And indeed, if you look in the dictionary, you'll see that it says used with object, unless you just scroll down a bit more, because you'll see there's people using it without an object, because dictionaries have to show what is actually happening, not what is quote unquote supposed to happen. If they don't, it's a bad dictionary. And this is called descriptivism rather than prescriptivism. So this person can say the sentence is wrong all they want, but if I look at the sentence and say it's fine, and if 51% of the English speakers in the world look at the sentence and say it's fine, then guess what? It's grammatical. And if all English speakers disappear, then there are no rules to English. It doesn't have a grammar. It's just made up. It has no more of a grammar than like Klingon or Phyrexian or anything like that. But even outside of sociolinguistics, it is tricky to define a language. Generally speaking, when we talk about languages, of course, people think something like this. You have language A, and then language B, and then you have dialects that come out of them. So in English, for instance, you would have British English, and then the dialects under that. You would have American English, and the dialects under that, Australian English, etc. And a separate language will then have its own dialects, and then there's some contact things, such as when two dialects or two varieties touch, they can create a pidgin, which is like a bird that is found in a number of places around the world, which is like a semi kind of combined language where people adopt features of a language. And if a pidgin hangs around long enough that the people who speak that pidgin start having kids and things like that, and the kids grow up learning that pidgin, that will become a creole, which is like a pidgin with a kind of filled in grammar structure. It's very interesting. The kids will kind of do that on their own. But it's really not that simple, because try to answer this question. How would you differentiate one language from another? How would you say that English, for instance, is different than Japanese? What is a criteria that you could say that will work as an absolute rule for dividing one language from another? Most people, of course, would jump to mutually unintelligible. That's very understandable. But there are many cases around the world where mutually unintelligible speech varieties are considered part of the same language. The one that people think of probably most commonly are the various varieties of language that are spoken throughout China, as the Chinese government calls these all Chinese. And things like, for instance, Mandarin Chinese and Cantonese are, in their spoken forms, mutually unintelligible. People like to rag on China for this, but honestly, they're not doing anything that isn't being done all around the world. For instance, there's something called the ISO 639-3 criteria, which is a criteria for classifying languages. And they also note that if intelligibility is not there, having a shared literature or a shared culture is enough for something to be considered a language. And indeed, in, say, Mandarin Chinese and Cantonese, they can read the same writing. If they read it aloud, it sounds different. Here's an example from a really great informative video.
So for example, if you want to ask where the bathroom is, in Cantonese it's 洗手間喺邊度啊?
In Mandarin, you say 洗手間在哪裡?
If I say that what he said in Cantonese, it still makes sense. So 洗手間在哪裡?
But there is that connection there. And while I will say that China does like to present itself as unified in some ways that I don't necessarily agree with, the Chinese time zone to me is quite hilarious. The fact of the matter is every single language on Earth is doing the same thing, just maybe not to the same extent. For instance, can you understand this?
What happened?
Oh, well, it's really quite funny. I was in bed sleeping at 2 o'clock this morning. My wife comes in and says, oh, the shop's been, someone ran into the shop. And I said, oh, what?
Well, maybe that's just a semi-thick Australian accent. But what about this?
I can hear him in your Saturday night. Right. The kid drove his mom out. I had to get out, home. Mom's been calling and cussing at me all day. She was behind the counter. She said, it's a lie, Jack. I said, who's that, Mom?
That's a variety of English spoken in America by people who grew up in America. Now, they read and write the same letters that I do, but I cannot understand most of what was being said there. And yet, if I said that wasn't English, I think they would be upset. Likewise, there are Japanese dialects which are unintelligible to the vast majority of Japanese speakers. Here's an example.
皆さんすごいです
娘は、
え
朝喫茶勤めで、
え
昨日とで一緒になって、
はいはい
福祉しこまいだ。しこまいだ。
しこま
全く理解できず、会話不成立。
Yes, by the way, it is really unfortunate to label someone's speech style with a bunch of wingdings. That upsets me too. Japan doesn't treat its dialects with the proper respect. But that's an issue for a different video. Nevertheless, that is Japanese. Or is it? That person certainly would consider themselves Japanese, but say let's talk about the Ryukyuan languages that are spoken throughout Okinawa and the islands down there. From the perspective of the Japanese government, Ryukyuan and Japanese are both part of the same language, which is Japanese. From a linguist perspective, though, generally speaking, we fight a lot. You would have the Japonic language family, which would then split to Ryukyuan and Japonic, and then from Japonic you go into Standard Japanese and its dialects, rather than uniting everything under Nihongo. But who's going to stop the Japanese government from making this distinction? You? It's like they say, a language is a dialect with a navy and an army, and I don't have a navy and an army, but Japan does, so they get to choose. And there's also, though, the flip side, where you do have mutually intelligible varieties, but for whatever reason, usually cultural, the two groups decide that they want to be different languages. A number of languages spoken, for instance, throughout Scandinavia are more or less intelligible, certainly more intelligible than some of the dialects of English and Japanese that I've shown to Standard English and Standard Japanese. Yet they consider themselves different languages because they have different borders, they have different backgrounds, they have different cultures. Urdu and Hindi is another case that's been described quite a bit in sociolinguistic literature as they're basically mutually intelligible, certainly to the same extent that like Mexican Spanish and Spain Spanish would be, but they have different writing systems and they've had a little bit of acrimony between the two cultures, so they often get treated as different languages. And the thing is, we can't say that anyone's wrong because we all kind of made it up. Maybe thousands and thousands of years ago, it was a bit easier to say this is a language, this is not a language. But the fact of the matter is actually that no language on Earth would exist without impact from other languages. Like, generally speaking, I still think we can say that if there's no cultural background connection, if there's no literate connection, and if the languages are not mutually intelligible, then they're not the same language. I think that's a definition that most people would be okay with. Like, I don't know anyone calling Japanese and English the same language, but there's no question that English as it is spoken now would not be the same if it wasn't for Japanese, and there's no question that Japanese as it's spoken now would not be the same if it was for English. So maybe they are. Japanese has borrowed a huge number of English words. English dictionaries and Japanese dictionaries both have tons of borrowed words from both. And minimally we can say that while saying that the same language would be something very few people would agree with, the borders between them are very, very porous. Example I mentioned in videos a long time ago is the word skosh, because I grew up using that. I believe it's an American regionalism, but it was very common where I was growing up. So you'd say like, oh, would you like some milk in your coffee? Oh, just a skosh. Do you have a skosh to talk about something? It was a very, very common. I didn't realize that came from Japanese until I took Japanese 1 and learned the word skoshi. It's subtle, it's kind of hidden. And you also have things called calques, which is where a word is just translated literally into your language and hidden from the fact that it's borrowed. The uncanny valley sounds like a very English phrase, but it's a calque from Japanese. Long time no see is probably a calque from Chinese. That doesn't match English grammar at all, but we just say it. So what all this means at the end of the day is that it's really hard to say that this is a language, this is a dialect, this language is different from this language, because people have different opinions, and from a kind of objective perspective, they're all sort of right. Indeed, arguably, I don't know anyone making this argument, but arguably, if a shared background and shared cultural connection is enough, since all languages probably came from the same region ultimately, given that all humans kind of came out of the same area, you could say that we're all speaking the same language from one perspective, or at least dialects of it. Although that's kind of obviously a useless waste of time argument. But in theory, and I once met someone, for instance, who said that American English and British English should be considered different languages, and while I don't agree with them at all, there are cases on Earth that they could raise to make that point and argue for it. Really, the only thing we can say about languages for sure is that they're in a constant state of flux, they're constantly changing, and they're constantly bashing into one another and evolving as a result of that. This doesn't mean that classifications, etc. aren't useful, but it does kind of mean that we all have to ignore some inconvenient facts when it comes to the labels that we use and the various social divisions that happen, because ultimately language is social. We use language to communicate with people, and so the conflicts and connections that people have are going to manifest in the conflicts and connections that our languages have, or that we say our languages have, because that fits the way that we want to look at the world better. So that's why in my videos I say we don't know what languages are, or I say real Japanese in air quotes, and why me and other linguists have our eyes twitch when we have to use phrases like grammatical error. Because obviously the perspective that I'm giving you in this video is not one that, say, students in my introductory Japanese class would find productive or useful. I can't just go into class and be like, hey, it's all made up, doesn't matter, we're done. But it is all made up. From a cosmic perspective, it doesn't matter, and so we actually are done.